The fluorescent lights of St. Margaret's Hospital cast harsh shadows across my mother's pale face as the machines kept their steady rhythm around her bed. I clutched the crumpled discharge papers in my trembling hands, the red "payment required before procedure" stamp burning into my vision like a brand. $68,000. That's what it would cost to save the only person who had ever believed in me. The cardiac surgeon had been clinical in his explanation, but his message was crystal clear. No money, no surgery, no mother. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I pressed my face against the cool window of the hospital corridor, watching other families navigate their own crises with what seemed like effortless grace. They had insurance, they had savings, they had family members who didn't hang up when you called asking for help. I had 3 jobs, a maxed out credit card, and relatives who had already made it abundantly clear that my mother's emergency was not their problem. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, 24 years old, working as a night shift janitor in this very hospital, mopping the floors where families said goodbye to their loved ones, emptying trash cans filled with tissues soaked in tears, cleaning the same corridors where I now stood, facing my own impossible choice. For 2 years, I had walked these halls invisible, just another face in scrubs, pushing a cart of cleaning supplies. Now, I needed this place to see me, to help me, to somehow bend the rules that seemed carved in stone. But first, let me tell you how we got here, how my family's cruelty became the catalyst for something I never could have imagined. 3 days earlier, I had been sitting in the emergency room waiting area, still wearing my McDonald's uniform from my afternoon shift, when Dr. Martinez delivered the news that would shatter my world. My mother, Elena Vasquez, had suffered a massive heart attack while walking to her job at the laundromat. The damage was extensive, he explained, in that careful way doctors have when they're about to change your life forever. She needed immediate surgery, a complex procedure that would require a team of specialists and potentially weeks of recovery. The estimated cost made my knees buckle. I had exactly $437 in my checking account and another $200 in cash hidden in my bedroom dresser. My mother, who had been uninsured for 3 years since losing her job at the textile factory, had no safety net beyond me. We were what the social workers called the working poor, too poor to afford insurance, but supposedly too rich to qualify for assistance programs that never seemed to account for the reality of our lives. I called my uncle Roberto first, my mother's brother, who owned a successful construction company in the next county. He had always been distant, but family was family, right? The conversation lasted exactly 47 seconds. "Isabella, you know I'd help if I could, but business has been slow. Maybe you should look into those charity programs at the hospital." Click. My Aunt Carmen, my mother's sister, who lived in a beautiful suburban home with her doctor husband, was even more direct. "Isabella, your mother made her choices. She could have gotten insurance through the marketplace. We can't be expected to bail out poor planning." The contempt in her voice cut deeper than any knife. My father's side of the family had disowned us years ago when he left, as if my mother's abandonment was somehow contagious. Cousin after cousin, uncle after uncle, the responses were variations on the same theme. "We're sorry, but we can't help. Have you tried Medicaid? What about a payment plan? Why don't you start a fundraiser online?" Each rejection felt like a physical blow. These were people who had attended my high school graduation, who had eaten at our table during holidays when times were better, who had watched my mother work 2 jobs to keep us housed and fed after my father disappeared with his secretary and our savings. Now, when we needed them most, they treated us like strangers asking for handouts. The financial counselor at the hospital, Mrs. Henderson, was kind but realistic. She walked me through every possible option with the patience of someone who had delivered this conversation countless times before. Medicaid would take weeks to process, if we even qualified. The Charity Care Program had a 6-month waiting list and strict income requirements that somehow we exceeded despite feeling desperately poor. Payment plans were available, but they required a down payment of $20,000. "What happens if I can't pay?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened with genuine sympathy. Isabella, I wish I had better news. Without payment or approved financing, we can't proceed with the surgery. We'll keep your mother comfortable and stable, but the procedure itself, she didn't need to finish. We both understood. That night, I sat beside my mother's bed, watching her sleep fitfully, oxygen tubes snaking across her face like transparent veins. Her hands, once strong from years of manual labor, looked fragile against the white hospital sheets. She had aged a decade in the 3 days since her heart attack, as if her body was already beginning the process of letting go. Mija, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of machines. Don't worry about the money. If it's my time, it's my time. It's not your time, Mama, I said, gripping her hand. I'm going to figure this out. But privately, I was drowning. I had already taken out a payday loan that would destroy my finances for months just to cover the emergency room bill. My credit was too poor for any substantial loan. I had nothing to sell except my beat-up car, which might bring in $3,000 if I was lucky. I was running out of options and time. The next morning brought a conversation that would haunt me for weeks. My mother's eldest sister, Aunt Rosa, finally returned my desperate voicemails. She lived in California now, married to a wealthy businessman with 2 kids in private school and a house worth more than most people make in a lifetime. Surely she would help. Surely family meant something to her. Isabella, sweetie, I'm so sorry about Elena, she began, and for a moment, hope flickered in my chest. But you have to understand, we have our own expenses. The kids' tuition alone is $60,000 a year. We just can't take on someone else's medical bills. Aunt Rosa, she's your sister, I pleaded. She helped you when Uncle Miguel left you. She sent you money when you had nothing. That was different. We were all young then. People make choices, Isabella. Your mother chose not to get insurance. She chose to work jobs without benefits. We can't enable that kind of decision-making. The word enable hit me like a slap, as if my mother's illness was some kind of moral failing, as if working multiple minimum wage jobs to keep food on the table was a character defect. What if I pay you back? I tried desperately. I'll work extra shifts. I'll get a 4th job. I'll sign whatever papers you want. Oh, honey, you work at McDonald's and clean offices. Even if you worked every day for the next 10 years, you couldn't pay us back. Be realistic. Realistic. The word my family kept throwing at me like a weapon. Be realistic about my mother's chances. Be realistic about our financial situation. Be realistic about what people like us could expect from life. After she hung up, I sat in the hospital bathroom and cried until my chest ached. I had exhausted every family connection, every desperate possibility I could think of. My mother's friends from the laundromat had started a collection that raised $800, a gesture that meant more to me than my relatives' rejections, but wouldn't even cover a single day in the cardiac unit. That's when I decided to do something that terrified me, but felt like my only option left. I was going to throw myself on the mercy of the hospital administration. I was going to walk into the executive offices and beg them to save my mother's life. I had cleaned those offices for 2 years. I knew every executive schedule, every assistant's name, every security guard's routine. I knew which conference rooms were used for the important meetings and which bathrooms the administrators preferred. I had been invisible to them, but I had been watching, learning, preparing for a conversation I never thought I would need to have. Dr. Patel, the hospital's chief medical officer, was my first target. I had cleaned his office enough times to know he kept family photos on his desk and donated to children's charities. Surely he would understand. I waited outside his office for 3 hours, finally catching him between meetings. "Excuse me, Dr. Patel. I'm Isabella Vasquez. I work in housekeeping here, and I was hoping to speak with you about my mother's case." He looked confused, clearly not recognizing me despite the fact that I had cleaned around him dozens of times. "I'm sorry, but patient cases need to go through the proper channels. Have you spoken with financial services?" "Yes, sir, I have, but they say there's nothing they can do. My mother needs heart surgery, and we can't afford it. She's going to die without this operation." His expression softened slightly, but his response was practiced, institutional. "I understand this is difficult, but we have protocols for financial hardship cases. The system exists for a reason. I can't make exceptions for individual cases. But you could if you wanted to, couldn't you? I mean, you're the chief medical officer. Miss Vasquez, I appreciate your situation, but I can't discuss this further. Please work with financial services. One by one, I attempted to reach every administrator I could identify. The chief financial officer's assistant wouldn't let me pass the waiting area. The director of patient services listened politely but offered nothing beyond what I had already been told. The chief of cardiac surgery was compassionate but explained that his hands were tied. Each rejection chipped away at my remaining hope. I began to understand that my mother and I existed in a different world from these decision-makers. To them, we were a case number, a financial risk, a problem to be managed rather than people to be saved. The fact that I worked in their building, that I had spent countless hours maintaining the spaces where they made life and death decisions, meant nothing in the face of institutional policy. On the second day of my desperate campaign, security approached me. Someone had complained about a housekeeper bothering executives. I was politely but firmly told that any further attempts to bypass normal channels would result in disciplinary action. The message was clear: know your place. That evening, I sat with my mother as her condition continued to deteriorate. The doctors were keeping her stable, but stable wasn't the same as getting better. Her heart was damaged, weakening daily without surgical intervention. Time was running out, in ways that were both abstract and terrifyingly concrete. "Mija, I need to tell you something," she said during one of her more lucid moments. "In my purse, there's an envelope with some papers, my insurance information from the factory job." My heart jumped. "Mama, you said the insurance ended when you were laid off." "It did, but there might be something. COBRA, continuation coverage. I never looked into it because we couldn't afford the premiums. But maybe—" Her voice trailed off as exhaustion overtook her. I found the envelope and spent hours that night poring over insurance documents I didn't fully understand. COBRA was available, but it was retroactive only 18 months, and my mother had been without coverage for 3 years. There were other policies mentioned, supplemental coverage she had purchased years ago, but they had lapsed when she couldn't afford the premiums. At the bottom of the stack, I found something that made my hands shake. A life insurance policy from my mother's union days, one she had apparently forgotten about. The beneficiary was listed as me, and the payout was substantial enough to cover the surgery costs. For a wild moment, I thought this might be the answer, until I read the fine print. Life insurance, not medical insurance. It would only pay out after she died. The cruel irony was overwhelming. There was money available to help us, but only if I let my mother die first. I threw the papers across the room and screamed into a pillow until my throat was raw. The third day brought news that the delay was affecting my mother's prognosis. Dr. Martinez pulled me aside with the gentleness reserved for delivering the worst kind of news. "Isabella, her condition is deteriorating. The longer we wait, the riskier the surgery becomes. We need to move forward soon, or we may lose the opportunity entirely." "How long do we have?" I asked. "Days, not weeks. I'm sorry." That afternoon, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to see the hospital director directly, not his assistant, not through proper channels, but face to face. Richard Blackwood was a name I had heard whispered in the hallways, a figure so removed from the daily operations that most employees had never seen him. But I had cleaned his office, I knew his schedule, and I knew that sometimes desperate times required desperate measures. I had spent 2 years invisible in this hospital, moving through spaces where life and death decisions were made with the anonymity of furniture. Now I needed to become visible. I needed to become human to people who had trained themselves to see cases rather than individuals. My plan was simple and terrifying. The next morning, I would intercept Mr. Blackwood during his routine walk through the executive wing. I would have maybe 30 seconds to make my case before security removed me. 30 seconds to save my mother's life. I spent that night writing and rewriting what I would say, distilling my mother's story and our desperate situation into the most compelling argument I could craft. I practiced in the mirror until the words felt natural, until I could deliver them without breaking down. I prepared for the possibility that this final attempt would fail, that I would lose my job and my mother in the same week. But I also held on to a fragment of hope that somewhere in this institutional maze was a person with the power and willingness to see us as more than statistics. Someone who would understand that behind every financial hardship case was a family facing the unthinkable. As I tried to sleep that night, listening to the sounds of the city through my thin apartment walls, I thought about all the rejections, all the closed doors, all the people who had made it clear that my mother's life wasn't worth their investment. Tomorrow, I would find out if there was anyone left who might feel differently. The machines in my mother's room continued their steady rhythm, marking time we didn't have, counting down to a deadline I couldn't meet. But I wasn't giving up, not yet. Not when there was still one door left to knock on, one person left to ask, one chance left to save the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise me alone. Tomorrow, I would walk into the hospital director's office and fight for my mother's life with everything I had left. Tomorrow, I would discover whether mercy existed in a system built on policies and procedures. Tomorrow, everything would change. I just didn't know how much. The morning sun cast long shadows across the hospital's executive wing as I walked through corridors I had mopped hundreds of times before. My janitor's uniform felt like armor and prison all at once, marking me as someone who belonged here while simultaneously making me invisible to the people who mattered. I carried my cleaning cart as usual, but today it served a different purpose. Today, it was my ticket to the 20th floor, where decisions about life and death were made behind mahogany doors and floor-to-ceiling windows. Richard Blackwood's office suite occupied the entire northeast corner of the building, a testament to the hierarchy that separated people like him from people like me. I had cleaned these spaces every Tuesday and Friday for 2 years, learning his routines with the careful attention of someone whose survival depended on being unnoticed. He arrived at exactly 7:30 each morning, reviewed reports for an hour, then took a 15-minute walk through the cardiac wing to check on operations. It was during that walk that I planned to intercept him. My hands trembled as I positioned my cart near the elevator bank, timing my movements to coincide with his usual schedule. The executive assistants were just arriving, their designer heels clicking against marble floors that I had polished the night before. They nodded absently at me, their minds already focused on the important business of running a hospital empire. To them, I was as much a part of the building's infrastructure as the elevators or the air conditioning system. At exactly 8:45, the elevator doors opened and Richard Blackwood emerged. He was smaller than I had expected, barely taller than my own 5'6" frame, with silver hair and the kind of expensive suit that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. He moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to deference, his phone already pressed to his ear as he began his daily rounds. I abandoned my cart and followed at a distance, my heart hammering against my ribs. Security cameras tracked our movement through the corridors, and I wondered if someone was already alerting hospital security about the janitor who had stepped outside her designated areas. But I pushed forward, driven by the image of my mother's declining condition and the ticking clock that measured her remaining chances. As he approached the cardiac wing, I took a deep breath and called out, "Mr. Blackwood?" He stopped mid-conversation and turned, clearly surprised to be addressed by someone in housekeeping uniform. His expression was not unkind, merely confused, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly spoken. "Yes?" "Sir, my name is Isabella Vasquez. I work in housekeeping here, and I need to speak with you about my mother. She's a patient in the cardiac unit, and she's going to die without surgery that we can't afford." His phone conversation had apparently ended, and he studied me with the calculating gaze of someone trying to determine if this interaction was worth his time. "Miss Vasquez, I'm sure this is important to you, but patient financial matters need to go through the proper channels. Have you spoken with our financial counselors?" "Yes, sir, I have. I've spoken with everyone." Mrs. Henderson in financial services, Dr. Patel, the director of patient services, even your assistant. They all say the same thing: no money, no surgery. But you're the hospital director. You could change that if you wanted to. Something in my voice must have penetrated his professional detachment because he stopped walking and gave me his full attention for the first time. "What's your mother's name?" "Elena Vasquez. She had a massive heart attack 3 days ago. The surgery cost $68,000, and every day we delay makes it more dangerous. He was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Around us, the hospital continued its morning rhythm, nurses changing shifts, residents hurrying between floors, families beginning another day of bedside vigils. The sounds of life and death and hope and despair that formed the constant soundtrack of this place. "Walk with me," he said finally. We moved through the cardiac wing in silence, past rooms where other families faced their own crises. I caught glimpses of scenes that mirrored my own, whispered conversations with doctors, insurance paperwork spread across bedside tables, the hollow-eyed exhaustion of people who had discovered that healthcare in America was as much about financial navigation as medical treatment. "How long have you worked here, Isabella?" he asked as we passed the nurse's station. 2 years, sir. Night shift housekeeping. I also work at McDonald's during the day and clean offices on weekends." 3 jobs. It wasn't a question, just an observation delivered in a tone I couldn't quite read. "Yes, sir. My mother worked at Henderson Laundromat until her heart attack. We've been uninsured for 3 years, since she lost her job at the textile factory." We stopped outside the cardiac intensive care unit, where my mother lay connected to machines that beeped and hummed with mechanical persistence. Through the glass partition, I could see her sleeping form, diminished by illness and the weight of circumstances beyond her control. "That's her," I said, "room 314. Richard Blackwood studied my mother's chart on the digital display outside her room, his expression unreadable. "Dr. Martinez is an excellent surgeon. The procedure he's recommending has a high success rate." "If we could afford it," I said bitterly. "Isabella, I want you to understand something about how hospitals work. We're not just medical facilities, we're businesses. We have payroll to meet, equipment to maintain, research to fund. When we provide free care, that money has to come from somewhere. It usually comes from other patients who can pay." I felt my last hope beginning to crumble. This was going to be another gentle rejection, another explanation of why the system couldn't bend for people like us. "Sir, I understand that, but I'm not finished," he said, and something in his tone made me look at him more carefully. What I was going to say is that sometimes the business model fails us. Sometimes we have to remember why we got into healthcare in the first place. My breath caught in my throat. "I don't understand." "Let me ask you something. In 2 years of cleaning this hospital, have you ever stolen anything? Supplies, medications, equipment?" The question caught me off guard. "No, sir, never. Why would you ask that?" "Because housekeeping staff have access to everything: controlled substances, expensive equipment, patient information that could be sold. We've had problems with theft in the past. But in 2 years, you've never taken so much of a box of latex gloves home." "It's not mine to take," I said simply. "No, it's not. But a lot of people in your financial situation might see it differently. They might justify small thefts as compensation for low wages." He paused. "Your supervisors speak very highly of you. They say you're reliable, thorough, never miss shifts, even when you're sick." I didn't know how to respond. This conversation was not going where I had expected. "Tell me about your mother," he said, "not her medical condition. Tell me about who she is." The request surprised me, but I found myself talking about the woman who had raised me alone after my father abandoned us. I told him about how she worked double shifts to keep me in school, how she attended every parent-teacher conference, even when it meant losing pay, how she taught me that dignity came from honest work, regardless of how little it paid. I described her small acts of kindness, bringing soup to sick neighbors, helping other single mothers navigate bureaucratic systems, volunteering at the church despite having no money to contribute. "She sounds like a remarkable woman," he said when I finished. "She is, and she doesn't deserve to die because we're poor." Richard Blackwood was quiet for a long time, staring through the glass at my mother's still form. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, more personal. "My father was a coal miner in West Virginia. Black lung disease took him when I was 16. We couldn't afford the treatments that might have extended his life, so I watched him suffocate slowly over the course of 2 years." I felt a jolt of recognition. This wasn't just hospital administration speaking. This was someone who understood what it meant to lose a parent to poverty disguised as medical necessity. I went into hospital administration because I wanted to build systems that would prevent other families from going through what mine did. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But somewhere along the way, the systems became more important than the people they were supposed to serve. He turned to look at me directly. "You've reminded me of something I had forgotten." "What's that?" "That every policy, every procedure, every financial protocol exists to serve patients, not the other way around. When the system stops serving people, it's the system that needs to change, not the people who need help." My heart was racing, but I was afraid to hope. "Does that mean—" "It means I'm going to make some calls. I can't promise anything, but I want to explore some options that may not have been presented to you." The relief that flooded through me was so intense that my knees nearly buckled. "Mr. Blackwood, I can't thank you enough." "Don't thank me yet. I said I'd explore options, not that I'd found a solution. But I want you to know that regardless of what happens with the financial arrangements, your mother will receive the surgery she needs. We'll figure out the payment afterward." I started crying right there in the hallway. 2 years of stress and fear and desperation finally finding release. "I don't know how to repay you." "You already have. You've worked here for 2 years with integrity and dedication. You've earned this consideration." Over the next several hours, Richard Blackwood did something that no one else in the hospital hierarchy had been willing to do. He treated our case as a problem to be solved rather than a policy to be enforced. He convened a meeting with the chief financial officer, the head of cardiac surgery, and the director of social services. Together, they examined every possible avenue for making my mother's surgery financially viable. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. The hospital had received a substantial donation the previous year, specifically designated for cardiac care for uninsured patients. The funds had been sitting unused because the application process was so complex that most families who qualified were unaware of the program's existence. My mother's case fit the criteria perfectly. The donor was very specific about wanting to help working families who found themselves in impossible situations through no fault of their own, explained Jennifer Walsh, the director of social services. "Your mother's work history and your own employment record demonstrate exactly the kind of circumstances the fund was designed to address." There were forms to complete, documentation to provide, and approvals to secure, but the foundation was in place. My mother would receive her surgery, and the cost would be covered by the discretionary fund. The relief was overwhelming, but it was accompanied by a bitter recognition of how close we had come to losing her simply because no one had bothered to tell us this option existed. "Why wasn't this mentioned before?" I asked Mrs. Henderson when she appeared with the paperwork. Her discomfort was obvious. "The fund is complicated. The application process usually takes months, and we weren't sure your mother's case would qualify." "But it does qualify?" "Yes, it appears it does." What she didn't say, but what became clear through subsequent conversations, was that the fund was typically reserved for cases that generated positive publicity for the hospital. Families with compelling stories who could appear in newsletters and fundraising materials. Working-class families like ours, especially those with limited English or documentation issues, were usually steered toward other options. Richard Blackwood had bypassed the usual gatekeepers and advocated directly for our case. More than that, he had used his authority to streamline the approval process that typically took months into a matter of hours. It was an extraordinary intervention that probably violated numerous protocols and procedures. The surgery was scheduled for the following morning. Dr. Martinez explained the procedure in detail, walking me through each step with the patience of someone who understood that knowledge helped families cope with fear. The operation would take approximately 4 hours, followed by several days in intensive care and potentially weeks of recovery. The prognosis was good, but there were always risks with cardiac surgery, especially given the delay in treatment. That evening, as I sat beside my mother's bed, she was more alert than she had been in days. The knowledge that surgery was finally scheduled seemed to have lifted a weight from her spirit as much as mine. Mija, how did you do this? She asked, squeezing my hand with more strength than I had felt in weeks. I asked for help, Mama. I kept asking until someone listened. Your father always said you were too stubborn for your own good, she said with a weak smile. Tonight, I'm grateful for that stubbornness. We talked about everything and nothing, memories of my childhood, her dreams for my future, her fears about the surgery, her pride in how I had handled this crisis. It was a conversation that felt both routine and precious, the kind of exchange that would have been impossible if we had been forced to accept defeat. Promise me something, she said as visiting hours were ending. Anything. Promise me that if something happens tomorrow, you won't let this experience make you bitter. The world has good people in it, like that Mr. Blackwood. Don't let the bad ones make you forget that. Nothing's going to happen, Mama. Dr. Martinez says the surgery has a 90% success rate. I know, Mija, but promise me anyway. I promise. The next morning brought a flurry of pre-surgical preparations, consent forms, final consultations, the ritualistic transfer from the cardiac unit to the surgical suite. I walked alongside my mother's gurney as far as the operating room doors would allow, holding her hand until the last possible moment. See you on the other side, she whispered as they wheeled her away. The waiting room became my world for the next 4 hours. I paced the corridors, drank terrible coffee from vending machines, and tried to distract myself with magazines I couldn't focus on reading. Other families shared the space with their own anxieties, creating a community of worry that transcended individual circumstances. At hour 3, Dr. Martinez emerged to provide an update. The surgery was proceeding well, but they had discovered additional blockages that required more extensive repair work. This was good news and bad news. Good because they could fix everything in one operation, bad because it meant more time under anesthesia and a longer recovery period. Finally, after what felt like forever, Dr. Martinez appeared in the waiting room with the expression I had been praying to see. The surgery was successful. We were able to repair all the damage and restore normal blood flow. Your mother is stable and responding well to the anesthesia. The relief was so profound that I couldn't speak for several minutes. I just sat in that uncomfortable waiting room chair and cried tears of gratitude and exhaustion and overwhelming relief. Recovery was slow but steady. My mother spent 3 days in intensive care, connected to monitors and machines that tracked every aspect of her healing heart. I maintained my work schedule as much as possible, but the hospital staff made accommodations that allowed me to spend more time at her bedside than normal visitor policies would have permitted. Richard Blackwood stopped by twice during her recovery, both times bringing small gifts: flowers, magazines, a care package from the hospital cafeteria. These visits were brief and professional, but they represented something important to me. He had followed through on his commitment not just to approve the surgery, but to ensure that we felt supported throughout the recovery process. "How are you holding up?" he asked during his second visit. "Better than I was a week ago," I said. "I still can't believe this worked out." "It worked out because you fought for it. Most people would have given up after the first few rejections. I couldn't give up. She's all I have. And you're all she has. That's a powerful motivator." During those recovery days, I learned more about the donor fund that had saved my mother's life. The money had come from the estate of a former patient whose own family had struggled with medical bills during his extended treatment for cancer. He had specifically requested that the funds be used to help working families avoid the financial devastation that his own family had experienced. The irony was striking. A system that had failed one family had been transformed by that family's generosity into a lifeline for others facing similar circumstances. But the fund's existence remained largely unknown because publicizing it would create more demand than the hospital could meet. It was a well-kept secret, available only to those persistent enough to reach the highest levels of administration or lucky enough to encounter someone willing to advocate on their behalf. My mother's recovery progressed ahead of schedule. By the end of the first week, she was sitting up in bed and complaining about the hospital food, both signs that her strength was returning. By the second week, she was walking the corridors with physical therapy assistants and talking about returning to work, though the doctors were clear that full recovery would take months. The financial paperwork was processed with efficiency that stood in stark contrast to the bureaucratic obstacles we had encountered initially.
The donor fund covered not just the surgery costs, but the entire hospital stay, follow-up appointments, and medications. For the first time in years, we weren't calculating whether we could afford necessary medical care. But the experience had changed something fundamental in how I understood the world. I had learned that the difference between life and death, between hope and despair, often came down to finding the right person with the right authority at the right moment. That systemic barriers could be overcome by individual intervention, but only if someone with power was willing to exercise it on behalf of people without power. I had also learned that my own persistence had been essential. If I had accepted the first rejection, or the fifth, or the 10th, my mother would have died. The system was designed to discourage people like us from seeking help, to exhaust our resources and resolve until we simply gave up. Only by refusing to accept defeat had I created the opportunity for someone like Richard Blackwood to intervene. 3 weeks after the surgery, as my mother prepared for discharge, she received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Martinez arrived with a folder full of papers and a serious expression that immediately put me on edge. "Is everything okay?" I asked. "Is there a problem with her recovery?" "No, nothing like that. Your mother's recovery is excellent. I wanted to discuss something else with you both." He sat down and opened the folder. "The hospital administration has asked me to talk to you about a position." "A position?" my mother asked. "Isabella, your advocacy for your mother's care was remarkable. You navigated our system more effectively than most insurance professionals. The administration is wondering if you might be interested in working with our patient advocacy program." I stared at him, not sure I had understood correctly. "You're offering me a job?" "A different job. You'd work with families facing financial hardships, helping them navigate the system and identify resources they might not know about. The donor fund that covered your mother's surgery, for example. There are other programs, other options, but they require someone who understands both the medical side and the financial reality that families face." The offer was both flattering and overwhelming. It would mean leaving behind my multiple part-time jobs for a single position with benefits and a salary that would finally allow us to live with dignity. But it also felt surreal, as if I were being offered a reward for simply refusing to let my mother die. "Why me?" I asked. "Because you understand what it feels like to be on the other side of these conversations. Because you have the persistence to fight through bureaucratic obstacles. And because Mr. Blackwood believes you have the integrity to use authority responsibly when you have it." My mother squeezed my hand encouragingly. "Take the job, mija. You can help other families avoid what we went through." That afternoon, I walked through the hospital corridors one more time as a member of the housekeeping staff. I retrieved my personal items from the staff locker room, said goodbye to colleagues who had become friends, and prepared for a transition I never could have imagined just weeks earlier. The woman who had started this journey invisible and powerless was ending it with a voice and platform to advocate for others facing similar crises. It felt like more than a career change. It felt like a calling that had emerged from our darkest moment. Part 3. The Transformation. 6 months later, I stood in the same corridor where I had once intercepted Richard Blackwood, but everything had changed. Instead of pushing a cleaning cart, I carried a tablet loaded with patient advocacy software and resource databases. Instead of wearing a housekeeping uniform that rendered me invisible, I wore business attire that commanded attention and respect. Most importantly, instead of being powerless to help families in crisis, I had become the person other desperate relatives sought out when the system seemed impenetrable. My office was located in the patient services wing, a small but dignified space with a window overlooking the hospital's healing garden. The walls were decorated with thank you cards from families I had helped navigate financial hardships, each one representing a crisis averted, a life saved, a family kept intact. The work was challenging and emotionally demanding, but it provided something I had never experienced before: the knowledge that my daily efforts made a tangible difference in people's lives. The position had required extensive training in insurance regulations, federal assistance programs, and hospital financial policies. I had studied medical billing codes, learned to navigate Medicare and Medicaid bureaucracies, and developed relationships with social workers, case managers, and financial counselors throughout the region. The learning curve had been steep, but my lived experience with the system's failures gave me insights that no amount of formal education could provide. My first major case had involved the Rodriguez family, whose 8-year-old daughter needed emergency appendix surgery. Like my mother and me, they were caught in the gap between poverty and middle-class stability, too poor to afford insurance premiums, too wealthy to qualify for Medicaid. The father worked construction jobs without benefits, the mother cleaned houses under the table, and they had been living paycheck to paycheck until their daughter's emergency hospitalization threatened to destroy them financially. I had spent 3 days researching their options, making phone calls to charitable organizations, and advocating directly with hospital administration. Eventually, I discovered that their daughter qualified for emergency Medicaid coverage due to her age and the family's income level. But the application process required documentation that would take weeks to assemble. By working with the billing department and the state Medicaid office, I was able to expedite the approval process and secure retroactive coverage for the entire hospital stay. The gratitude in Maria Rodriguez's eyes when I delivered the news reminded me powerfully of my own desperation just months earlier. "How did you know about this program?" she had asked through tears of relief. "Because I've been where you are," I had replied, "and someone helped me when I needed it most." Each success built my confidence and expanded my understanding of the complex ecosystem that determined whether families received necessary care or were turned away. I learned about charity care programs that hospitals were required to offer but rarely advertised. I discovered federal grants for specific conditions, state programs for uninsured workers, and nonprofit organizations that provided emergency financial assistance for medical bills. More importantly, I learned how to advocate effectively within the hospital's internal structure. I understood which administrators had discretionary authority, which policies could be waived under exceptional circumstances, and how to present cases in ways that motivated decision-makers to bend rules rather than enforce them rigidly. The work was not without its challenges. For every family I was able to help, there were others whose situations were truly insurmountable. The system's inequities were vast and deeply entrenched, and individual advocacy could only address a fraction of the underlying problems. Some days I left the office feeling defeated by the magnitude of suffering that financial barriers created in American healthcare. But other days brought victories that reminded me why this work mattered. Like the elderly veteran whose disability benefits had been incorrectly calculated, leaving him unable to afford his cardiac medication. I had spent hours on the phone with Veterans Administration bureaucrats, eventually discovering an error in his file that had cost him thousands of dollars in benefits over several years. Correcting the mistake not only resolved his immediate crisis, but resulted in a substantial retroactive payment that secured his financial stability. Or the young mother whose premature twins required extended NICU care, costing hundreds of thousands of dollars. Her insurance had been canceled due to a paperwork error, and the company was refusing to reinstate coverage or pay for the baby's care. I had worked with the hospital's legal department to challenge the cancellation, eventually forcing the insurance company to acknowledge their mistake and cover the full cost of treatment. These cases taught me that persistence and detailed knowledge of regulations could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. They also reinforced my understanding that the difference between financial ruin and security often came down to having someone with expertise willing to fight on your behalf. My mother's recovery had progressed remarkably well. She had returned to work part-time at a different laundromat, one that provided health insurance benefits for employees. Her energy had returned gradually, and regular cardiology checkups showed that her heart function had improved significantly following the surgery. More importantly, the stress of constant financial worry had been lifted from both our lives. We had moved to a larger apartment in a safer neighborhood, one where I didn't worry about walking alone at night after evening shifts. My mother had her own bedroom for the first time in years, furnished with a comfortable bed and reading chair where she spent quiet hours recovering her strength. The financial stability my new position provided had transformed our daily existence from survival mode to something approaching normalcy. But the experience had changed us both in ways that went beyond improved circumstances. My mother spoke more freely about her fears and aspirations, no longer constrained by the need to appear strong in the face of insurmountable challenges. I had discovered capabilities and confidence I never knew I possessed, learning that I could navigate complex systems and advocate effectively for people who needed help. The donor fund that had saved my mother's life became a central focus of my work. Richard Blackwood had asked me to help develop better procedures for identifying and assisting qualifying families, recognizing that the fund's impact was limited by the hospital's failure to connect eligible patients with available resources. Working with the development office, I created a streamlined application process that reduced the approval timeline from months to weeks. I developed training materials for financial counselors to help them identify cases that might qualify for assistance. Most importantly, I began conducting outreach in community organizations, churches, and social service agencies to educate families about resources they might not know existed. The fund's donor, I learned, had been Thomas Morrison, a retired machinist whose own family had faced financial devastation during his lengthy battle with cancer. His wife had contacted me several months after I began working with the fund, wanting to understand how her husband's final gift was being used to help others. Margaret Morrison was a soft-spoken woman in her 70s who had spent her own savings caring for her husband during his final years. Tom was so angry about what we went through, she told me during our meeting. Not about being sick, but about the way the system treated us, like we were asking for charity when we were asking for basic human decency. She described how her husband had worked for 40 years in manufacturing jobs, paying taxes and contributing to his community, only to discover that his employer-provided insurance had coverage limits that were exhausted during his first round of chemotherapy. They had been forced to mortgage their home, liquidate retirement savings, and rely on family loans to continue his treatment. The doctors kept him alive for 3 extra years, she said. Good years, mostly. He got to see our grandchildren graduate from high school, attend our daughter's wedding, take one last fishing trip to Minnesota. Those years were precious, but they shouldn't have cost us everything we had worked for. Tom Morrison's bequest had been specifically structured to help working families avoid the financial devastation that his own family had experienced. He had insisted that recipients be people who had contributed to their communities through honest work, who found themselves in crisis through no fault of their own, and who needed assistance to access medical care that would preserve their health and dignity. Meeting Margaret Morrison deepened my appreciation for the responsibility I carried in administering her husband's final gift. Each family I helped represented not just my own advocacy efforts, but the legacy of a man who had transformed his own suffering into assistance for others facing similar challenges. One of my most challenging cases involved the Chen family, whose teenage son had been diagnosed with a rare form of cancer requiring experimental treatment not covered by their insurance. The father was a restaurant owner whose business had been struggling since the pandemic, the mother worked as a seamstress, and they had used their savings to keep the restaurant afloat during the economic downturn. The treatment protocol required travel to a specialty cancer center in another state, along with extended hospital stays and medications that cost tens of thousands of dollars per month. Their insurance company had denied coverage, classifying the treatment as experimental despite its proven effectiveness for their son's specific condition. I spent weeks researching their options, consulting with medical social workers at cancer centers across the country, and connecting with nonprofit organizations that provided assistance for families dealing with rare diseases. Eventually, I was able to piece together a combination of resources: partial funding from a childhood cancer foundation, assistance from a pharmaceutical company's patient access program, and coverage for travel and lodging expenses through a nonprofit that specifically helped families access distant medical care. The process required coordination between multiple organizations, extensive documentation of the family's.
Richard Blackwood had asked me to join a committee examining systemic improvements to the hospital's charity care and financial assistance programs. The goal was to create policies that would prevent families from reaching crisis points before discovering available resources. The committee's work involved analyzing denial patterns in financial assistance applications, identifying gaps in current programs, and developing proactive outreach strategies to connect at-risk families with support services. We discovered that many families who qualified for assistance never applied because they assumed they wouldn't be eligible or because the application process was too complex for people dealing with medical emergencies. Working with the billing department, we created new protocols that automatically flagged accounts where families might qualify for assistance, triggering outreach calls from patient advocates before bills became overwhelming. We simplified application forms, translated materials into multiple languages, and established satellite assistance centers in community health clinics and social service offices.
These systemic changes were slower to implement than individual advocacy efforts, but they had the potential to help hundreds of families who would never have found their way to my office. The work required patience and persistence, navigating hospital bureaucracy, and convincing administrators that preventive assistance was more cost-effective than emergency interventions. But the effort was producing results. 6 months after implementing the new protocols, the hospital's charity care approvals had increased by 40%, while emergency financial assistance requests had decreased by 25%. Families were receiving help earlier in their medical crises before financial stress compounded their health challenges. The success of these initiatives had attracted attention from other hospitals in the region. I began receiving invitations to speak at conferences about patient advocacy and financial assistance programs. These presentations allowed me to share lessons learned from my own experience and the families I had helped, contributing to broader conversations about healthcare accessibility and equity. Speaking to audiences of hospital administrators, social workers, and healthcare policy experts was initially intimidating, but I discovered that my combination of personal experience and professional expertise provided a unique perspective that resonated with audiences. I could describe the patient experience from the inside while also offering practical solutions that other institutions could implement. One presentation in particular had stayed with me. I had been invited to address a state hospital association conference about innovative approaches to charity care. The audience included executives from hospitals across 3 states, many of whom managed institutions much larger and more complex than St. Margaret's. During the question and answer period, a CEO from a major urban hospital had asked how smaller institutions could afford to be as generous with charity care as our program seemed to suggest. His question implied that our approach was financially unsustainable and therefore irrelevant to hospitals facing stricter budget constraints. I had responded by sharing data showing that proactive financial assistance actually reduced bad debt and collection costs while improving patient satisfaction scores and community relationships. More importantly, I had reminded the audience that hospitals receive significant tax benefits as nonprofit organizations, benefits that came with obligations to serve their communities regardless of patients' ability to pay. The question isn't whether we can afford to help families in crisis, I had said. The question is whether we can afford not to help them. When people avoid necessary medical care because they can't afford it, when they delay treatment until emergencies require expensive interventions, when they declare bankruptcy because of medical bills, the entire system suffers. Everyone pays those costs eventually. The presentation had generated significant discussion and several follow-up invitations to consult with other hospitals developing their own advocacy programs. This consulting work provided additional income that further stabilized my family's financial situation while expanding my ability to influence healthcare accessibility beyond my own institution. But the most meaningful aspect of my transformation wasn't professional success or public recognition. It was the daily knowledge that my work prevented other families from experiencing the desperation and helplessness that had nearly destroyed my mother and me. Every phone call answered, every application approved, every barrier overcome represented a crisis averted and a family preserved. The thank you cards covering my office walls told stories of resilience and recovery. Children who received life-saving treatments, elderly patients who maintained their independence, families who avoided bankruptcy and foreclosure because medical bills didn't destroy their finances. Each card represented not just my advocacy efforts, but the generosity of donors like Tom Morrison, and the willingness of administrators like Richard Blackwood to prioritize human need over institutional convenience. My relationship with Richard Blackwood had evolved from desperate supplicant and powerful administrator to colleagues working toward shared goals. He had become a mentor who provided guidance on navigating hospital politics and developing sustainable advocacy programs. More importantly, he had taught me that individual acts of compassion could create systemic change when they were leveraged effectively. "You've become everything I hoped you would when I offered you this position," he told me during my 6-month performance review. "But you've also become something I didn't anticipate, a leader who's changing how this institution thinks about its responsibilities to the community." The compliment was gratifying, but it also carried weight. Leadership meant responsibility not just for individual cases, but for the broader systems that determined whether families received necessary care. It meant using whatever influence I had gained to advocate for policies that would prevent other families from facing the choices my mother and I had confronted. One area where I had been able to exercise this influence was in the hospital's relationship with collection agencies. Previously, accounts that remained unpaid after charity care review were automatically referred to external collectors, often without additional attempts to identify assistance options. I had convinced administration to implement a secondary review process that brought accounts back to patient advocacy before collection efforts began. This change had resulted in identifying additional assistance options for dozens of families whose initial charity care applications had been denied due to incomplete documentation or missed deadlines. Some families qualified for retroactive Medicaid coverage, others were eligible for payment plans with reduced principal amounts, and still others could be assisted through previously unknown grant programs. The collection agency changes had also revealed disturbing patterns in how financial assistance decisions were being made. Families with complex immigration statuses were being denied assistance they were legally entitled to receive. Non-English speakers were struggling with application processes that weren't adequately translated or explained. Families dealing with mental health crises or substance abuse issues were falling through gaps in the system due to incomplete follow-up on their cases. Addressing these disparities required additional training for financial counselors, expanded translation services, and partnerships with community organizations that served vulnerable populations. The changes were incremental but significant, expanding access to assistance for families who had been systematically excluded from programs designed to help them. My mother had become one of my most valuable advisors in this work. Her perspective as someone who had navigated the system as a patient provided insights that complemented my professional training. She attended community outreach events with me, sharing her story with families who were facing similar crises and helping them understand that assistance was available if they were persistent enough to find it. "Tell them not to give up," she would say to families dealing with insurance denials or charity rejections. "Isabella almost gave up, and look what happened when she didn't. There's always one more person to call, one more option to try." Her presence at these events was particularly powerful for Spanish-speaking families who felt intimidated by hospital bureaucracy. My mother's ability to explain complex assistance programs in accessible language, combined with her credibility as someone who had successfully navigated the system, helped bridge cultural and linguistic barriers that often prevented families from accessing available resources. The success of our outreach efforts had convinced hospital administration to formalize community engagement as part of the patient advocacy program. I had been given a budget to sponsor health fairs, attend community meetings, and develop educational materials for distribution through churches, schools, and social service agencies. These community connections had created a network of referral sources that brought families to my attention before their situations became desperate. Pastors, teachers, social workers, and community leaders knew to contact me when they encountered families struggling with medical bills or insurance problems. This early intervention approach prevented many families from reaching the crisis point that my mother and I had experienced. One of the most rewarding aspects of this work was training other hospitals to develop their own advocacy programs. The consulting requests that had emerged from my conference presentations had evolved into a formal partnership with the State Hospital Association to provide technical assistance for institutions wanting to expand their charity care and financial assistance efforts. This work involved site visits to other hospitals, meetings with administrators and staff, and the development of training materials and policy templates that could be adapted to different institutional contexts. Each consultation provided opportunities to learn about innovative approaches being developed elsewhere while sharing lessons learned from my own experience. One particularly memorable consultation involved a rural hospital serving a primarily agricultural community. The facility was struggling with high rates of uninsured patients and limited resources for charity care, but the administrators were committed to serving their community regardless of patients' ability to pay. Working with their staff, I helped develop a streamlined assistance program that leveraged federal rural health grants, state agricultural assistance programs, and regional philanthropic foundations. The program was simpler than what we had implemented at St. Margaret's, but it was appropriate for their smaller scale and limited administrative capacity. 6 months after implementation, the rural hospital's charity care approvals had tripled, and they had secured additional grant funding to expand their assistance programs. More importantly, families in their community were receiving necessary medical care without facing financial ruin, and the hospital's relationship with the community had been strengthened through their visible commitment to accessibility. These consulting experiences had reinforced my understanding that sustainable change required adapting solutions to local contexts, rather than imposing uniform approaches. Each hospital served different populations with different needs, different resources, and different I had described the Rodriguez family's struggle to afford their daughter's appendix surgery, the Chen family's battle to access cancer treatment, and my own mother's near-death experience due to financial barriers to cardiac care. These aren't abstract policy questions, I had told the legislative committee. These are decisions about whether families lose their homes to pay medical bills, whether children receive necessary treatment, whether people die because they can't afford to live. Every family I work with represents dozens of others who don't know help is available or don't have access to advocacy services. The committee's vote had been close, and Medicaid expansion hadn't passed that session, but the testimony had contributed to ongoing conversations that would eventually lead to policy changes. The work was incremental and often invisible, but it was part of a larger movement toward healthcare accessibility that required sustained effort from many different voices. My mother's health had continued to improve throughout this period. Her cardiologist had recently cleared her for full activity, and she had begun volunteering with a seniors fitness program at the community center. The transformation in her energy and optimism was remarkable, but so was her continued commitment to helping other families avoid the crisis we had faced. "I want to do more," she told me one evening as we planned an upcoming community health fair. "I want to make sure other families know about the help that's available before they get desperate like we did." Her suggestion led to the development of a peer support program where families who had successfully navigated medical financial crises were trained to provide guidance and encouragement to others facing similar challenges. The program paired experienced families with newly diagnosed patients, creating mentorship relationships that provided both practical assistance and emotional support. The peer support initiative had been one of our most successful innovations. Families dealing with medical crises often felt isolated and overwhelmed by the complexity of insurance systems and hospital bureaucracy. Having access to someone who had successfully navigated similar challenges provided both practical guidance and hope that solutions were possible. My mother had become one of the most effective peer mentors, particularly for Spanish-speaking families and elderly patients dealing with cardiac issues. Her combination of lived experience, natural empathy, and detailed knowledge of available resources made her an invaluable member of our advocacy team. "It's like having a sister who's been through it before," one family had written in their feedback about the peer support program. "Elena doesn't just tell you what to do, she shows you that it's possible to get through this." The success of these various initiatives had attracted national attention to our hospital's advocacy program. I had been invited to present at conferences in other states and had been contacted by researchers studying innovative approaches to healthcare accessibility. The recognition was flattering, but it also created opportunities to influence practice and policy on a broader scale. One research collaboration had been particularly meaningful. A team of health economists from a major university had asked to study our advocacy program's financial impact, both on families and on the hospital itself. Their analysis had demonstrated that proactive financial assistance reduced collection costs, decreased emergency department utilization for non-urgent care, and improved patient satisfaction scores. More importantly, the research had shown that families who received assistance were more likely to complete recommended treatments, maintain regular follow-up care, and achieve better health outcomes. The financial assistance wasn't just preventing bankruptcy, it was enabling better medical care and improved health for vulnerable populations. The research findings had been published in a prestigious health policy journal and cited in congressional testimony about healthcare financing reform. Seeing our local work contribute to national conversations about healthcare accessibility felt like validation that individual advocacy efforts could influence systemic change when they were documented and shared effectively. But the most meaningful validation continued to come from families whose lives had been changed by the assistance we provided. Each successful case reminded me that behind every policy discussion and research finding were real people facing impossible choices about health, family, and financial survival. The latest case to cross my desk involved a young veteran whose military service had left him with chronic pain and PTSD. His disabilities made it difficult to maintain steady employment, but his benefits weren't sufficient to cover the costs of comprehensive pain management and mental health treatment. He had been cycling between emergency department visits for pain crises and periods of untreated depression that left him unable to function. Working with veteran service organizations, the hospital's social work department, and several nonprofit foundations, I had been able to coordinate a comprehensive care plan that addressed both his immediate medical needs and his long-term financial stability. The process had taken weeks of phone calls, paperwork, and advocacy, but the veteran was now receiving consistent treatment that had dramatically improved his quality of life. I thought I was going to have to choose between getting help and going bankrupt, he had told me during our final meeting. You showed me that wasn't a choice I had to make. His gratitude was humbling, but it also reinforced my understanding of how arbitrary the difference could be between families who received assistance and those who didn't. Success often depended on factors beyond individual merit or need. Knowing the right person to call, understanding which programs to apply for, having the persistence to navigate bureaucratic obstacles, or simply encountering an advocate willing to fight on your behalf. This recognition had motivated my efforts to systematize advocacy services and expand access to assistance for all families who needed help. The individual victories were meaningful, but systemic change was necessary to ensure that access to healthcare didn't depend on luck or personal connections. 2 years after starting this work, I had been promoted to Director of Patient Advocacy, overseeing a team of advocates and expanding our services to include insurance navigation, appeals assistance, and preventive financial counseling. The department had grown from my single position to a comprehensive program that assisted hundreds of families each year. The growth had been gratifying, but it had also highlighted the enormous scope of need that existed in our community. For every family we helped, there were others who never found their way to our services or whose situations were beyond our capacity to address. The systemic inequities in American healthcare were vast and deeply entrenched, requiring policy changes and social reforms that went far beyond what any individual hospital could accomplish. But within the constraints of our institutional capacity, we had created something meaningful, a program that treated healthcare as a human right rather than a commodity, that prioritized patient need over ability to pay, that recognized the dignity and worth of every family regardless of their financial circumstances. Richard Blackwood had announced his retirement, and his successor had already committed to maintaining and expanding the advocacy program we had built together. The institutional support was gratifying, but it also represented a recognition that this work had become integral to the hospital's mission and identity. During his farewell reception, Richard had pulled me aside for a private conversation. "When I intervened in your mother's case, I thought I was just helping one family," he said. "I never imagined it would lead to all this." "Neither did I replied. "I just wanted to save my mother's life. And look what you built from that. You've changed how this institution thinks about its responsibilities, how hundreds of families access care, how other hospitals approach charity services. That's quite a legacy." His words were generous, but they also highlighted something important about how change happens in complex systems. Individual acts of compassion and courage could create ripple effects that extended far beyond their immediate impact, inspiring others to action and creating momentum for broader reforms. My mother's story had become our story, then our community story, then part of a larger national conversation about healthcare accessibility and equity. The transformation felt both personal and universal, connecting our individual experience to broader movements for social justice and systemic reform. As I reflected on the journey from that desperate day when I intercepted Richard Blackwood in the hospital corridor to my current position leading a comprehensive advocacy program, I was struck by how much had changed and how much remained the same. The fundamental inequities that had nearly killed my mother still exist, still threaten families throughout our community and across the country. But within the scope of our influence, we had created alternatives to despair. We had built systems that prioritized human need over institutional convenience, that treated financial barriers as problems to be solved rather than insurmountable obstacles. We had demonstrated that healthcare institutions could serve their communities with compassion and maintain financial sustainability. Most importantly, we had proven that individual advocacy could create systemic change when it was sustained, strategic, and supported by institutional leadership willing to prioritize mission over profit margins. The work was far from finished, but it had begun, and it was growing. My mother's heart was strong now, her future secure, her dignity restored. But her legacy extended far beyond her own recovery to encompass every family who would receive assistance through programs built from our shared experience of crisis and transformation. In seeking to save one life, we had created resources that would save many others. That was the real victory. Not just surviving the system's failures, but transforming them into foundations for helping others. Not just receiving compassion in our moment of greatest need, but creating institutional capacity for compassion that would outlast our individual circumstances. The work continued, would always continue, because the need was constant and the stakes were always life and death. But it continued with hope now, with resources, with knowledge that solutions were possible when people with power chose to use it responsibly and people without power refused to accept defeat. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.